We are privileged today to bring on our first presenter, Mark Sangster, Vice President at Adlumin, as well as an author. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much. And yeah, it's an honor also to be kicking off as your keynote for today's ceremonies.
Thank you. That's absolutely fantastic. We're so excited. Mark is going to start us off with an excerpt from his novel, No Safe Harbor. I'm quite looking forward to hearing this. If you have the chance, please pick up No Safe Harbor. It's an incredible read. We're going to come back when Mark is done, and then we'll be kicking off his segment with Adlumin. Thanks, Mark.
Terrific, Dave. Thanks. So as we bring the slides up today, I'm going to spend about a half an hour or so talking about the book No Safe Harbor. The book came out about 2 years ago, and I'm actually working on an update to it now and a second book, in fact. But it was born out of spending time in boardrooms, speaking to executives and technical leaders, and trying to bring them together, and realize that the message I was delivering time and time again was the exact same thing. Trying to debunk some of the misconceptions around cybersecurity and, more importantly, cyber risk, to up-level the message to help executives recognize that cybersecurity is not an IT problem to solve, but rather it's a business risk to manage. And then so it was from that I decided to write the book. And it's based on a lot of the cybersecurity stories, obviously things that I've dealt with, things in finance, in manufacturing, and the legal community, and so on. But to do that, what I found is I used a bunch of stories that had nothing to do with security. And the reason I do that is twofold. The first thing is, when we look at other industries as an example, so whether this is things like oil and gas or extractive industries, whether it's construction and architecture or aviation, they have their own sets of standards when it comes to safety, to compliance. And we can learn from those because they have a more public kind of view of that, right? If you think about that, horrific train derailment in Quebec as an example, there was a public inquiry into it. We learn all the factors. We understand what happened and what all the, what contributed to that disaster. And from that, we can kind of get that, the reverse image, right? Or the photo negative that tells us what we need to do to prevent it in the future. And cybersecurity is a lot more diffuse. A lot of these decisions occur in closed courtrooms or boardrooms and settlements, and we never actually understand what's happened. So we don't have the same kind of sharing as those industries. But the second, and I think the almost more important one, is that it's a very neutral field to have this discussion. Because when I talk about cybersecurity, well, the problem is everybody starts thinking about, budgets and fiefdoms, and executives go, well, you just buying the next shiny toy or whatever it means, or you're scaremongering and things like that. So when we use a neutral forum, we can discuss it and agree what the factors were, agree how we would implement the recommendations that come out of that. And then we bring that back to cybersecurity, because now it's a lot harder to have that conversation. It's like you've acknowledged a risk, you've acknowledged vulnerabilities, you've determined how you can limit or mitigate those vulnerabilities. And now you're kind of, it's like you're painting them into a corner. So I'm going to start today. I'm just going to tell you a quick story from Canadiana and history from the late 80s. And like I said, I'll bring that back to cybersecurity. So I always love using pop culture and movies and so on. And so this first one, only after disaster can we be resurrected. And I believe it's a very accurate statement, right? And of course, it comes from the fictitious character Tyler Durden from the Chuck Palahniuk novel and a subsequent movie, Fight Club. And yes, he's fictitious, but really the notion of what he's talking about, the message is quite real. And, the other one I could use is Winston Churchill, who always said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And they're bang on. So I also do think we learn more from our disasters, right? We learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes, because our successes we just internalize. We don't really delve into all the factors that made it a success. However, when we make mistakes, when we have failures, that's when we sit down and we try to determine what went wrong, so next time we can make it go right. So I'm going to start with a very similar story. Back on a beautiful sunny day in 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 was a passenger flight between Montreal and Edmonton. It actually made it stop in Ottawa, but we're going to skip that. Midway through the flight at an altitude of 41,000 feet, this effectively brand new 767 ran out of fuel. Like the tanks were dry. Of course, it's a completely unheard of circumstance, right? I mean, by then, aviation was fairly safe. We had a lot of controls in place. A lot of the accidents we saw through the 50s, 60s, and 70s had kind of been mitigated through aviation regulations, and the actors within the industry sort of upping their game. So what happened? At 41,000 feet, the port of the left engine failed, right? It effectively stalled out, and in the cockpit, alarms went off. And the pilots assumed, because this is not unusual, the pilots assumed that there was a failed fuel pump. There's fuel tanks in both wings and under the center of the belly to help the center of gravity in the aircraft. So there's lots of sort of standardized procedures and protocols that they use here to effectively cross-feed the various fuel tanks, and they're back in business. Of course, about 6,000 feet later, as the plane is slowly descending, because when this happens, they have an emergency protocol, so they start to descend to a lower altitude where there's breathable oxygen, and then they also begin to consider heading to an alternate destination or a landing site if that's closer. So about 6,000 feet later, the starboard engine then also quit. Now, this is unheard of. In fact, it's so unheard of, there is no procedure in the emergency manual from Boeing for the 767, because it was assumed that because of all the cross feeds and the multiple redundancies in the aircraft, that this couldn't possibly happen. Now, of course, when it did, they declared an emergency and they diverted from Edmonton to Winnipeg, which was significantly closer. Now, the problem was, without power, of course, the aircraft is mostly out of control, because think about your car today with power steering, power brakes, and so on, that if you were to lose the power, driving down the 401 as an example, it would be a lot harder to steer, and you'd be using a lot of force on that brake pedal to try and slow the car. It's the same in the aircraft. Without power, they are left with fundamental controls. So basic things like an altimeter. They have some other controls to understand, the elevation and alignment of the aircraft and so on. So as the aircraft slowly descended as they were heading towards Winnipeg, and the pilots were sort of fighting the aircraft, the captain was flying, and the co-pilot was trying to determine what to do and go through the emergency procedures. After about 20,000 feet of lost altitude, they realized they could not restart the engines, and they began measuring their glide scope, because it turned out serendipitously that the captain, was actually an experienced glider pilot and an instructor. So he understood powerless flight, and he worked with the co-pilot to then determine what's called their glide scope. So that is, based on my altitude and how fast I was going when I lose power, how far can I glide? Think of it like this. If you were standing on the ground and you threw a paper airplane, how far would it go? But if you stood on the top of your house or a second story balcony and you threw the same airplane with the same force, it's going to go significantly farther, because it has more altitude, even though it had the same speed or acceleration. Now, as they did this, by about 9,000 feet, they realized that based on their glide scope and the calculated distance to Winnipeg, they weren't going to make it. In fact, they were going to land about 10 to 15 nautical miles short of that westerly direction. But again, as it happens, serendipitously, the co-pilot was a retired Royal Canadian Air Force fighter jet pilot who had flown his fighters out of a small disused base called Gimli on the shores of Lake Winnipeg. Trusting his co-pilot, the captain turned north, because that location was within their glide scope, and they aimed for the runway. Now, just to give you some context, this was a disused base. It was not even on the aviation maps, but the co-pilot knew it was there from experience, and his captain trusted him. So slowly, as the aircraft descended, they made final approach for runway 32 left. As they landed, now this is actually from a fictional representation. It's from the movie Falling from the Sky, Flight 174. So they kind of did a TV adaptation of the story. The 767 touched down on the runway. And of course, because it was disused, lots of people, disused from the military, a lot of people used it for other purposes. And that day, there actually are, as the captain recounts and witnesses on the ground, there were two kids who happened to be cycling down this runway at the time. And because the aircraft was virtually silent, they didn't really know until about the last minute when one of the kids looked back. And as the captain said, you can only imagine the profanity and the shock that was coming out of this poor child's mouth as he saw this 160-ton aircraft barreling down on them. Now, luckily, the aircraft came to a stop, and there were no deaths. There were minor injuries. Most of that was things like turned ankles, broken ankles, and so on from those people that exited through the tail of the aircraft, where the emergency exit and the slides were too steep. There's a lot of hurt feelings and so on, but that was it. Considering a full aircraft at 41,000 feet that ran out of fuel was able to make a powerless landing, this was miraculous. And in fact, of course, the press then nicknamed it the Gimli glider. Now, there's a couple things in the photograph that you can notice. Number one was on landing, the nose gear collapsed. Now, that's because of the fact that the aircraft wasn't powered, so there was no hydraulic power to actually lower the gear. And that means when they put down the landing gear, they used what's called a gravity drop. And they hope that the actual weight of the assembly itself is going to drop it hard enough that it's going to lock into place. And the nose gear didn't. But as you can see, there's something odd in this picture. You don't typically see a guardrail running down the middle of a runway. And that's because at the time, the runway was being used by a local motor racing club. And in fact, it happened to be their annual Family Day festival. So they had all of their members there, various different races, drag races, open wheel racing cars, go-karts, kids on bikes, etc. But the guardrail was also helpful because as the nose gear collapsed, the captain was able to use the rudder to keep the nose of the aircraft against the guardrail so that it didn't start turning and slide off the runway, potentially barrel rolling. Or as you see, it stopped meters short of this festival that was going on. It's good news, bad news. The bad news was, had this gone wrong, a lot of people on the ground could have also been severely injured or killed. The good news was nobody did. But the other thing is, like most motor racing events, there's a lot of emergency services there, ambulances and fire trucks, et cetera, in case there's a crash. So those people were able to rush to the aid of the passengers in the aircraft. And there was a fire in the nose, but that was effectively friction caused from the nose sliding around along the ground. And they were able to easily put this out. So when we started to investigate this, the pilots themselves, Captain Robert Pearson and First Officer Quintel, were hailed as heroes, and the press and the media loved them. Of course, shortly after that, as the investigation began, the airline then condemned them for making fatal mistakes or near fatal mistakes that led to this accident. The captain was demoted and suspended, as was the first officer. So why did this happen in the first place? So first of all, if you remember this, for all of us Canadians, back in the 80s, we were converting from the imperial measurement system to the metric system. So that led to confusion when the ground crews and the pilots were fueling the aircraft. So they had to do two conversions very quickly because number one, of course, when you think about fueling an aircraft, it's different than pulling up to a pump to put gas in your car, right? When we do that, what do we use? We use a volume we use a volume measurement of liters. Well, the problem is if we all go back to about grade 6 science, we'll remember that fluids expand and contract depending on the temperature. So the volume, the liters or gallons that you put in the aircraft sitting on the ground at whatever that level is above sea level is going to be different than what it is at 41,000 feet when it's near freezing temperatures. So you actually have to use mass or weight, right? So you have to convert not just liters to gallons, but also gallons and pounds to kilograms. And so there was sort of a double confusion. And at the time, there was a short memo that went out that said, look, this is how you do the conversion. And unfortunately, there was some trickery in that. And what ended up happening was that two ground crews and the pilots miscalculated and filled the aircraft with about 50% of the fuel that it required. So it's no surprise that about halfway to Edmonton from Montreal, it ran out of fuel. Now, the other complicating issue was that the gas gauge, or as you call it in the aviation industry, the fuel quantity information system, was inoperable. And this was a known issue on the Boeing 767, a relatively new aircraft. This was the first fly-by-wire system, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And what that meant is that there were 3 computers. They'd literally take a vote to decide which readings were the most accurate. And they were finding conflictions. And if you read the book, I go into this in details, but effectively the story is too many chefs in the kitchen spoil the stew. And unfortunately, there was a comedy of errors here. The fuel quantity information system was disabled. The pilots expected that to be the case. So they didn't have that redundancy and backup. However, they did use effectively a dipstick into the tanks to measure the volume, but based on their errant calculation, they thought they were okay. This aircraft was also one of the first generations of a glass cockpit, so a fully digital cockpit. We're moving away from sort of World War II, cables and cables and wires and gears to actuators and computer guided inputs. So as the pilot make their control inputs, computers calculate what the pilot's trying to do and activate the flight surfaces safely. So there's another factor in this. This was one of the first aircraft that removed or made redundant the flight engineer or the third pilot. And guess what? The flight engineer's job, one of the primary roles, was to fill the fuel tank. That left the co-pilot and the captain, without experience doing this, to kind of fumble around and use back of the napkin math as they tried to look at this very confusing memo that they had received. And then the last part of this was, as part of the digital cockpit, was the flight management system, or the FMS. So again, this was the dawn of the digital era. You could plug in where you were, the weight of the aircraft, where you were going, how much fuel was on board. It would calculate the flight distance and directions for you and tell you if everything was good and safe. These pilots had come from that post-World War II era of flying, where it was fly by the seat, using your gut instinct, to this kind of digital age. And like many of us at that point, they trusted the computer and the engineers that built them as being smarter than they were. So they believed it when the computer said, we're good to go. So when I look at this at the high level, when you look at the risk factors, and there's actually a screen cap of the final report that came out from the Ministry of Transport and Safety. And so we have these factors. We have these miscalculations and operational gaps, the people part of it. We have the exposure, right? We have the new technology, the mechanical failure that occurred on this new aircraft that hadn't yet been fixed. So we had those systemic issues. And we had the regulatory or compliance issues, right? So we had outdated governance. We didn't have effective training. Compliance changes were just trying to catch up to these regulatory federal rules that had just come in around using the metric system. So there was this period of flux or unknown, right? And think about this in cybersecurity terms, because it's the same. We face the same issues. Now, in human error, we do have human error. I'd actually move those into exposures, but we have adversaries, people who are intentionally trying to down that aircraft, in parallel. You have the exposures, the industry risks that come, from whatever business that you participate in. In healthcare, they want to steal your healthcare records. In banks, they want to steal your money, right? In manufacturers, they want to cripple your operations so that they can extort ransoms out of you, and so on. You have the new technology that's coming in, adoption of the cloud, work from home. We saw the same kind of shift during COVID when we went to this remote work model. That changed our baselines. A lot of the things we were using to assess what we called normal completely changed for a period of time, maybe 6 months, until they settled again for us to re-baseline and then begin to detect those anomalies. And then, of course, is the accountability part, right? There's the regulatory and the contractual obligations. Insurance coverage. We're seeing insurance is a huge issue now. Anybody wants to talk about that, I'd be very happy to, and I will touch on it in the next presentation in the second part of this program. But there's also the obligations that you have between you and your supply chain, and you and your customers. And we have to think about that. Unfortunately, when we consider accountability, a lot of times it's old school. It's about compliance. We have a regulator. I've got boxes I have to check, or rules that I have to follow, guardrails I have to stay in between. But we don't really think about the spirit of the law. We're thinking about the letter of the law. And that's what we have to change. We really do have to think about it. And this is the point. This is the thing I want you to walk away with from this story. All too often, we blame a simple factor, and I'll get to that in a minute. When we blame it, when we blame the last link in the chain, the human who didn't patch a system, as an example, the insider who was able to access data they shouldn't have and stole it, we're robbing ourselves of the chance to identify the systemic issues, right? To really realize what were all the factors that went into this. And a lot of times they fall into these 5 buckets. Flawed assumptions, right? These are how we think the performance should be, whether it really is or not. And, I see this a lot of times with things like basic security controls, AV and firewalls. A lot of non-technical leaders think, well, I have AV, it's going to block all this badness, isn't it? All that malware just gets stopped, right? And firewalls, well, when it sees bad traffic or it sees a bad IP, it just blocks that stuff, right? And it's not that simple, right? So a lot of people labor under those misconceptions. There is human error all the time. At the end of the day, right, we do all the work. So, whether it's intentional human error, whether it's unintentional human error, like we become an unwitting accomplice through a phishing campaign where our credentials are surrendered, or we take an action that an unauthorized party wants us to take, whether it's intentional, that's rare, but it does occur, or whether or not it's part of our I call it our risk quotient, right? Or our risk profile. So think about the people you work with and think of yourself, right? There's a lot of us that kind of go, yeah, you know what? I am about the spirit of the law, but I'm going to bend the rules here and there because I need to get my work done. Or the other one, the complete rule follower who blindly just assumes that whatever the letter of the law is what they should do. So when someone in authority says do this, they just do it and they don't think about it, right? Even when it's telling them to break controls or policies and procedures, they still do it because an authority figure told them to. So there's lots of different ways to quantify and consider human error, right? There's lots of different vantage points to think about it. There's organizational lapses, right? Think about the 2019 Capital One data breach where, what was it, 110 million credit card records and applications were stolen by an insider. Well, that occurred for lots of different reasons, but one of the big factors was, of course, a misconfigured AWS firewall. But there were other things. The board was clamping down on budgets because Capital One at the time wasn't doing so well. So they were laying off security people. They were cutting expenses and so on. And that's what was important here. There's pre-existing failures. So think about the vulnerabilities in those systems that we simply don't know about, or systemic vulnerabilities, the old ones like Heartbleed or newer ones like Log4j and so on. And then unintended effects. And a really good example I have of this is, I don't remember if you remember this, but a few years ago when all these wearable technologies like, Apple Watches and Garmin's and all these things came on the market, it turned out that bad guys were able to map all the military bases around the globe because, military people happen to, keep themselves fit. And as they're tracking this and sharing their daily jog or run information, it effectively gave them a sort of an outline or a silhouette of where those bases were. And when they saw high traffic volumes, they could then go and make those determinations. So that's an unintended consequence. We don't necessarily know how these things will be used. In fact, in one of the chapters, I talk about that right from things like nanny cams as an example, or home security systems that get hacked and used against you. So I'm going to talk about a couple of factors here when it comes to how do you build resilience in your organization? How do you move away from blaming a single factor and looking at all of them? So the first thing is, as a story from Captain Al Haynes goes, when something goes wrong, everyone has a right to speak up. This is not about an authoritarian regime. This is not about a strict structure. In fact, at Japan Airlines aircraft, Japan Flight 007, ironically, flew into the side of a mountain because the co-pilot and the flight engineer were too scared to speak up to the highly experienced captain who was at the controls at the time. Now, Captain Al Haynes, for you, if you go and look him up on Wikipedia or whatever, he was the captain on United Airlines Flight 232, which was the famous late 80s Sioux City, Iowa crash. Again, they had a mechanical failure in one of the engines. It caused full hydraulic failure on the aircraft. They were only able to use the two wing-mounted engines to fly the aircraft home and to steer it. And they got within about 50 feet of the runway until the plane actually banked uncontrollably and unfortunately crashed. But about 2/3 of the passengers out of the 300 or the 260 passengers survived. This was an unsurvivable incident. And he actually became a champion for what's called CRM, or cockpit resource management, or crew resource management. And this is the idea about sharing, collaborating, having everyone bring their ideas to the table, because as he said in that moment, no one had experienced this scenario before. They had never done this in flight simulators. So there was no expert amongst them. They all needed to do that. The second thing is another aircraft or aviation accident researcher, and his name is Sidney Dekker, and he wrote the book, The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. And he talks about a couple of biases that are important. Hindsight bias. That's our notion that we have, we would be able to avoid that that negative impact, right? It's like, well, of course, if you don't wear your seatbelt, you're going to get injured, right? It's that kind of mentality. And worse is the outcome bias, which is once we see someone who's a contributor to this negative outcome, we blame them, right? And we want to punish them. We want to see some kind of justice, right? So that's the, well, of course, that person deserves to lose their license because they did something silly behind the wheel of the car. We don't really take all the factors into it. We don't really understand about all of it. Now, I add a couple of other factors. One is time, which is that we have a lean towards the last event in the sequence. And, I'll use a south of the border kind of example, from the NFL is, we're down to 3 seconds on the clock and the kicker has to kick the field goal to win the game. And when the kicker misses it, all of a sudden we're like, oh, that guy's a bum. They should have traded him years ago. The special teams coach should have been fired and so on down the line. And we all become couch quarterbacks. But we don't think about the other 59 minutes and 57 seconds of all the passes that didn't get made, the plays that failed, the defensive, strategies that didn't work, and so on. And then there's confirmation bias, and most of us understand this, right? Over time, we build a conceived notion of what we think is right or balanced, and we seek information that validates that, and we tend to ignore or somehow denigrate information that contrasts it, right? So, we see a lot of this fake news kind of statement, right? If they say something you don't like, well, that's because it's fake news. And unfortunately, these kind of biases pervade cybersecurity, cyber risk, and incident response planning. So it's important to keep these things in light. And in fact, I have an article in the cybersecurity peer-reviewed journal as well on this topic that goes into it in a lot more details. You also have to deal with all of the strong personalities that emerge. And again, I wrote another article on this, not just through Adlumin, but it again was published in a peer-reviewed journal, where I talk about the different types of personalities that come out during an incident. And some of them are the overt, the ones, right? They're the cowboy, the one that thinks they can do it all, and it doesn't matter what the team wants to do. They're the one with the right answer. There's the litigator, the person who watches too much CSI or Law and Order and now thinks that they're a lawyer, even though they never went to law school, and suddenly they're spouting all sorts of interesting information. There's the hoarder, right? The person who keeps all the information because information is king and power, and doesn't necessarily share it. There's the martyr, who's probably the IT person who feels that they're at the heart of this incident. And if they had only done their job better, they wouldn't have been victimized by this massive ransomware outage. And it's just not that simple. And there's others. I identify about 8 different characters. There's good news and bad news in this. These characters bring value, right? There are things here that they do that are important. The cowboy, the hero, the person like that who wants to be the savior, they're motivated to work, right? There's the martyr, who feels responsibility, takes responsibility for it, and wants to do something about it. The hoarder has all the information you need, and so on. So it's not about looking at them and saying, how do I quash that character? It's more about how do I harness it? How do I build in control? Because if you don't, what ends up happening is it erodes trust across the team, and this is where you run into problems. So again, I go into much more detail, and I talk about some of the sort of the social psychology behind this. And what a lot of the warning signs are as well as to when you see dysfunction across teams, right? So when you see this, what can you do? What are some of the triggers? And how do you reverse that process to make sure you have as best an outcome as you can? Now, I promised you some pop culture here. So everybody knows this, the Apple TV show, Ted Lasso. One of the things he actually quotes in the show is, be curious and not judgmental. And I talked about hindsight and outcome bias. And I talked about confirmation bias. And this is important. When it comes to preparing for these things, I use a model called COM-B. Now, COM-B actually comes from high-risk industries. So like aviation, trauma medicine, extractive industries, heavy machinery industries where a simple mistake can lead to severe injury, death, or destruction, right? And so what they talk about in this model is combining capability, right? Giving them the skills and the tools they need, the opportunity to develop the skills that they need, and motivating them. So this kind of negative outcome bias type of approach, right? That, okay, that person clicks on every phishing lure that comes through, we got to fire them. You're not going to solve the problem. You need to go upstream and ask yourself, how are many of these getting through? What secondary controls could I put in place even if this person clicks? Because the reality is, something is going to get through. If you are targeted, they're going to get you, and they don't look like those self-evidently fake kind of emails like, the Netflix lure that comes in saying your credit card's been rejected and to click on the convenient link to update your payment methodology. But when you combine these three, you see behavioral change, and that's what's important. You're here to drive behavioral change. A lot of times when we look at things like phishing training and assessment, we measure low metrics that aren't really indicative of the risk or the reduction of risk to the business. So there's a model called Kirkpatrick's model that's based around how do you assess the return on investment on things like human investment and training. And the lower assessments are things like learning, right? That's the test results, quiz results, click-through rates, surrender of credential rates, things like that. But it's when you move higher up, behavioral changes. Do you see new outcomes occurring? And then of course the impact to the business. Are you spending less? Are you losing less money to business email compromise? Has your operational uptime increased? Are the costs that you associate to security incidents reducing, and so on? So this is what you want to put into combination. And again, in that previous article I referred to, I talk about this in great detail. Now, again, I'll go back to the NFL, but this is he's actually a friend of mine, and he retired years ago. He was the quarterback for the Buffalo Bills shortly before a lesser-known quarterback named Jim Kelly came on the scene and took them to the Super Bowl for 4 years in a row. And one night we were sitting around his fire in Arizona and drinking whiskey, and he said to me, we were talking about football and we were talking about what it's like and all this kind of stuff. And he came out with this, and he said, you don't practice until you get it right. You practice until you can't get it wrong. And I had that aha moment, right? It was that this is exactly what I've been trying to say to people all along when it comes to things like tabletop exercises and awareness training, right? It's practice, practice, practice. Like the military and law enforcement, it is about creating muscle memory and hoping that memory comes into play when you're in that high risk situation. And there's a military expression I use for this because this is exactly what being in a live incident is like. It's VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and ambiguity. So somehow when you go through your practices, figure out how to introduce that, change things up, using Hunt for Red October, throw a crazy Ivan at them, right? Make a left turn or a right turn when they don't expect it. Give them information that turns out to be erroneous and then change the details shortly afterwards. Let them start to build a plan and go down a path and then make them take that urgent emergency pivot. That's important because that's what really happens in these kinds of circumstances. And lastly, I'm going to leave you with, again, another colleague and associate of mine. We do a lot of work together. This gentleman's name is Bob Darling. He's a retired colonel from the U.S. Marine Corps. He flew attack helicopters in both Gulf Wars. In fact, in one of them, he flew so low in a battle, he actually knocked the landing gear off his helicopter on a sand dune and had to land they placed shipping pallets on either side of the fuselage of the helicopter, and he's able to land the armament pylons on top of that and do it safely. He then went on to fly Marine One, which is the U.S. president's military helicopter for 3 different presidents. And from that, he wrote a book about his experience because during that, he happened to be in the White House during 9/11. And he wrote his memoirs about his experiences there. And he's very candid and very honest, which is amazing because he's highly critical of a lot of the players in that situation, including the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and others, which is impressive that he would, be able and also willing to and able to do that. But he talks about crisis leadership, and he talks about understanding your role, gathering the right people around you, understanding their expectations of you as a leader. You don't have to solve every problem, right? How do you listen to that team? How do you elicit their expertise and get the information you need? And this is what I always say. It's about making an informed decision at the right moment to then reduce the negative impact to the business. And ultimately, that is about providing the what and not the how. You're the leader here. You are not the security expert. You don't know what a domain controller is necessarily. You don't know what Cobalt Strike is. What you have to know is what threat that poses to the business. So I'll close this session out here before we move on to the next section. The outcome that you face in any disaster really comes down to 5 factors. 4 of them are in your control. The preparation you put in place, the cooperation of your team, knowing their roles and responsibilities. How do they communicate? Harnessing those strong personalities, avoiding biases and looking at impartial information, the communication strategies that you use, and your execution under pressure. But the last one, that's really luck, right? At the end of the day, that one is outside of your control. You can control 4. That's the most you can do. And that's what you have to do in any one of these incidents. So thanks very much. I hope that was informative. If you would like to learn more, please contact me on LinkedIn or at mbsangster.com. There are a lot more stories in the book. I talk about the Deepwater Horizon disaster. I also talk about a massive architectural failure in New York, not 9/11 and the World Trade Towers, but Citibank and a bunch of other stories. And of course, I roll into an executive level understanding of cyber risk and what the board and what the C-suite need to do to protect a business. So Dave, I'm going to throw it back to you for a few minutes. I know we're just a little over 9:30, and I'll certainly make sure that I shave that time off of my next presentation.
Mark, fantastic. It's always great to hear your presentations, and even more so out of No Safe Harbor. Every time I've taken a look at No Safe Harbor, every excerpt is just so riveting and capturing. How long did that book take you to produce?
I rushed it to market, but I started in November of the previous year. By February, I had all the drafts written, so that everything was kind of ready to go. Then it spent another 3 months going through multiple rounds of edits and fact checks and all that kind of stuff. And then it was printed and published in the fall. And there was a delay to going into the fall because I didn't realize this in the printer world. You print in the spring and you print at Christmas, and so there's summer reads and there's Christmas gifts, and that's kind of how it works. So it came out in the fall.
That's fantastic, Mark. Again, thank you so much for that today.